A 19-year-old named Reggie Cole entered one of the toughest prisons in the United States, where he had to face the king of that prison, nicknamed the Devil. Despite the violent events that happened to Reggie in his confrontation with the Devil, this encounter eventually led to something happy that he never expected, a story with thrilling events and an unexpected ending. So let's watch together the events of this story. Today's story is about Reggie Cole. Reggie was just a child when his family moved to Los Angeles in 1985. They moved to a dangerous area where crime and violence rates were on the rise, and many gangs operated. Reggie was the youngest of two boys and two girls. He was only 10 years old, and one of his older brothers, Kenny, who was 15, joined one of the violent gangs in that area. Over time, he started getting into big trouble, and the gang he belonged to had violent skirmishes and armed conflicts with another gang. One day, members of the rival gang launched a surprise attack on Kenny's gang. They arrived in their car with their weapons and quickly stormed the area where Kenny's gang was, shooting at a group of them standing on the side of the street. Kenny was standing with them and was killed. After this incident, Reggie was devastated, but he tried to focus on his studies to clear his mind and try to forget what happened to his brother. His family was trying to help him get through that difficult situation. However, Reggie's environment had a much stronger impact on him, of course. Since he was close to his late brother Kenny, he inherited his friends and acquaintances in this world of gangs and crime. Every year, Reggie drifted further and further away from his studies until he decided to drop out and immerse himself in the world of crime, following in his brother's footsteps. What made the situation even worse was the disintegration of his family and the separation of his parents. As for Reggie's siblings, his older brother, who was still alive, got a job in another city and left. His two sisters got married, and each lived alone with her husband. His father, after separating from his mother, left and lived alone somewhere else. No one stayed with him at home except his mother. His poor mother couldn't control them and was devastated every day as she saw Reggie drifting further and further away from her. Reggie's brother-in-law, his sister's husband, offered him a job at his plumbing company, but Reggie refused because he was living in another world at that time. Reggie started growing and selling marijuana. He didn't commit major crimes, but he was involved in selling marijuana and drugs. So no one was surprised when he was arrested for the first time when he was only 16 years old. The police saw him on the street and tried to ask him some questions, but he refused to cooperate and tried to escape. Shortly after, he was arrested again for possession of weapons. Unfortunately, Reggie followed in his brother's footsteps in this world, and most of his income came from selling marijuana up to that point. Although Reggie was immersed in the world of gangs, he had not yet been involved in any violent conflicts. But then years later, in 1995, when Reggie was 19 years old, he was arrested for stabbing a man near a well-known brothel in that area. Reggie was prosecuted, and the court found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Calipatria prison, one of the worst and most violent prisons in the United States. Reggie, dressed in orange, indicating he was a new inmate, boarded a bus along with other prisoners that would take them to the prison. The bus kept driving through the streets until it left the city and took a road that seemed blocked, with nothing around it. Reggie looked out the bus window and saw nothing but desert. Soon after, he could finally see Calipatria prison in the distance. It was a complex made up of several buildings, sprawling over a vast area. It was in the middle of nowhere, like a cemetery where people rejected by society were sent to live the rest of their lives in isolation. Reggie had been nervous ever since the bus left the courthouse, and the closer the bus got to the prison, the more nervous he became. As soon as they crossed the first gate of the prison, the first thing Reggie noticed was the smell of manure filling the place, coming from the prison's animal pen. Reggie lowered his head into his hands, which were tied to the seat, trying to ignore the smell, but it was in vain. The smell was overpowering. Then the bus crossed a huge fence that surrounded the entire prison. This fence was electrified, and if someone touched it, they would die instantly. Of course, all the prisoners knew this. In addition to this electrified fence, there was an inner fence that wasn't electrified. But if you crossed the inner fence, you would be met with this huge electrified fence, meaning that escaping from this prison through its fences was unthinkable. The purpose of this fence was to allow the guards to focus on the inside of the prison rather than on the walls and perimeters, Because the guards in this prison were few compared to the prisoners, one for every 50, meaning that for every 50 prisoners, there was only one guard. Just 3 months before Reggie entered the prison, there had been a famous incident where 5 prisoners in this prison had a big fight with the guards, which ended with the prisoners stabbing 8 guards. They stabbed them with knives they had made inside the prison. None of the 8 guards died, but this incident was big news that spread throughout the state of California, and everyone heard about it. The bus that brought Reggie and the new prisoners arrived at the main building of the prison, and most of the older prisoners were in the prison's outer yard, watching Reggie and the new prisoners. After the bus stopped, one of the guards got out and began calling the new prisoners one by one from the list he had. Then they took the detainees to the inspection room, where they were stripped completely to ensure they weren't hiding anything on their bodies. After that, they were given prison clothes and taken to their own cells. The cells in this prison were like tombs. They had 4 walls and a concrete roof, with no windows, and even the door was made of a metal plate with a small opening in the middle that could be opened and closed from the outside. This cell had a bunk bed, a sink, and a toilet. Reggie entered the cell and began to take in the place, looking around until he noticed someone sleeping on the lower bunk. This person was his cellmate. As soon as the latter saw Reggie, he turned his face to the other side, avoiding eye contact with him. Although this cellmate was the closest person to him most of the time, Reggie didn't know who he was, so he didn't want to provoke him by mistake. He could be a dangerous person. Reggie was convinced that to survive in that place, he had to avoid even talking to the other prisoners. When Reggie entered the cell, he avoided talking to his cellmate, and even without looking at him, used the ladder to climb up to his bunk and lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. From the first week in prison, Reggie knew how dangerous that place was, and that to survive, he had to be careful with everything and everyone. The first lesson Reggie learned was when a group of prisoners suddenly entered his cell, and his cellmate tried to welcome them and be friendly so they wouldn't hurt them. But those prisoners suddenly attacked him, beat him, and raped him while Reggie lay on his top bunk, trying to ignore the situation and pretending to be asleep so they wouldn't notice him. Since his cellmate didn't try to fight back or resist, this happened several times. Each time those prisoners broke into their cell, they did the same to his cellmate. And each time, Reggie tried to pretend he was asleep and ignored the situation, although he could hear what was happening. From that moment, Reggie realized that he needed to fight to survive in that place. He noticed that many of the prisoners had handmade knives, which meant they used ordinary things and somehow turned them into knives and sharp objects. So he also had to make his own knife. The only tool he had was his toothbrush. Using a stone, Reggie kept sharpening the tip of the toothbrush until it was sharp and ready to be used for stabbing, so his toothbrush became his knife. Every day, prisoners had the right to go out to the prison's outer yard. Reggie, while observing this situation, noticed that most of the prisoners were in gangs, and he felt that he would need to join a gang that would protect and back him up. But the problem was that it was difficult for new prisoners like him to join a gang right away. They first had to prove themselves. Reggie started looking for a gang that was close to his original gang that he had been with before being arrested. He tried to observe the situation from a distance without drawing anyone's attention. He knew that if he attracted attention, it would be like a death sentence for him. And although Reggie tried to stay out of trouble as much as he could, one day while he was walking in the prison yard, a group of prisoners suddenly caught him. It was clear that they were a gang, and the biggest one among them, who seemed to be their leader, approached him, grabbed his neck, and pinned him against the fence surrounding the outer yard. Reggie, while pinned against the fence, felt that all the prisoners' eyes were on him. Every prisoner in the yard would know what happened there, and he remembered the torment his cellmates suffered, so he realized that if he didn't react at that moment, he would suffer the same torment as his cellmate. Everyone would see him as easy prey, and many of them would dare to go after him. At that moment, Reggie knew that just as he had faced the giant prisoner who tried to attack him in the first week, now he had to face the devil of Calipatria prison. As soon as the guards asked Reggie about the knife, his response was, "No, it's not mine." It was just a short phrase and a few words, but it would change his life forever. Reggie had officially become the declared enemy of in front of everyone. Everyone was shocked when this phrase came out of Reggie's mouth, even the guards. They all wondered how this crazy person dared to confront. Reggie did not confront one after that, but he knew the situation he was in. He knew he had become his enemy. During the weeks following this incident, Reggie was always on high alert, expecting that or one of his aides would attack him at any moment. Even when he slept in his bed at night, he couldn't sleep comfortably. And whenever he went out to the yard during his break, he kept his eyes on Kiyu and his close aides, trying to stay away from him as much as possible and stay close to the guards or in a place where their eyes were on him so that Marnahan and his group wouldn't catch him. But a month later, in November 2000, one day while Reggie was walking in the yard, he noticed that one was approaching him. He wasn't even trying to surprise him or walk stealthily. He was heading directly towards him. Reggie didn't know what to do and got closer and closer until he was in front of him. He grabbed Reggie's shoulder with his left hand and stabbed him in the waist with his right. It wasn't a fatal stab, but it was a painful message. A message that Reggie's days in this prison were numbered. When Amano pulled the knife out of Reggie, he threw it on the grass and left. Reggie placed his hand over the stab wound while bleeding, and none of the prisoners who saw what happened tried to help him. They all looked away as if they hadn't seen anything, not even the guards. None of them tried to intervene. Reggie continued to press on his wound to reduce the amount of blood coming out. A quarter of an hour later, the bell rang, signaling the end of the break, and all the prisoners had to return to their cells. But before everyone lined up at the door to be searched, the guards checked them for weapons or contraband they might try to smuggle into their cells. It was a routine search that was always done after the break. All the prisoners were lined up. Aaron was at the front, and Reggie was 3 or 4 prisoners behind him. Reggie was still pressing his wound and trying to hide it from the guards. But the wound wasn't the only thing Reggie was trying to hide. He was also hiding the knife he had taken from the yard. He had buried a knife in a hole and had carefully concealed it so he could use it when needed. A few minutes before leaving the yard, he took out the knife and got in line, waiting his turn for the search with the knife in his pocket. When Maynham, who was at the front of the search line, reached the guard who began searching him from the front and then asked him to turn around to be searched from behind, turned around to be searched while looking at the prisoners behind him, and Reggie was in line among them, looked at him with disdain and a sarcastic smile while the guard was still searching him. Suddenly, Reggie, holding his wound, stepped out of line and quickly ran toward. He raised the hand holding the knife and stabbed in the throat. Everyone froze in place, unable to believe what had happened right in front of their eyes, opened his eyes in shock. This look of shock quickly turned into one of pain, and his enormous body staggered. The knife came out of his throat, and with his hands he tried to stop the bleeding by grabbing his neck. But the problem was that he was choking and couldn't breathe. All this happened in a matter of seconds, during which he fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Before the guards could move or react, Reggie lay on the ground with his hands on his head in a clear gesture of surrender, saying and shouting, "I know what I did, I know what I did," trying to show the guards that he would not endanger other lives and that his only target was an. Reggie was immediately arrested by the guards and placed in solitary confinement. The entire prison was on high alert that night. The death of Biran could lead to a huge mess in the prison, so all the prisoners were locked in their cells and were prohibited from leaving for any reason. Reggie was now facing his second murder charge, which meant that if he was tried, there was a high probability he would be executed, and there was almost no chance of avoiding a conviction for this crime. Everyone saw what happened, and he admitted it. The only thing that could save him would be to claim that he committed the crime in self-defense, and this was relatively true. But even if he managed to convince the judge that this was self-defense, and although he could avoid the death penalty, he would be sentenced to at least 10 years in solitary confinement. Reggie was very pessimistic to the point of seeing a dark future. Even when presented with a list of state-appointed attorneys who could represent him for free in court, he didn't think much of it and chose any lawyer from the list at random, thinking that the outcome would be the same in the end. But his belief was very wrong. The lawyer he randomly chose, Christopher B., would do something that Reggie hadn't even dreamed of. This lawyer, Christopher, would discover something that would change everything. Everything began when he started to delve into the files of the original case, for which Reggie was imprisoned. The murder case that took place in 1994 in front of a brothel. The victim in this case was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez. When two police officers, a man and a woman, arrived at the crime scene, they were able to find the manager of that brothel, whose name was John Jones, and arrested him for questioning because brothels are illegal. John Jones became the key witness in the case, and according to his account, he saw everything that happened that night from the second floor of the brothel. The victim, Felipe Gonzalez, arrived at the brothel, parked his car, got out, and knocked on the brothel door. He asked to meet a certain person, but was told that the person he was looking for was not there. After that, Felipe returned to his car, and suddenly 3 armed teenagers approached him. It was clear from their appearance that they were gang members, and they asked him for money. But Felipe Gonzalez did not speak English and did not understand them. Suddenly, these 3 teenagers shot him and killed him, then fled through one of the alleys. John Jones said he noticed that one of these teenagers was limping as they fled, so he assumed he had been shot during the attack, either by one of his friends or perhaps accidentally. The police officer in charge of this case was handling his first criminal case, so he began to look for criminals who had been arrested for other cases in the same area where the crime occurred. One of these criminals was Reggie. Reggie was 19 years old at the time, and as mentioned before, was working with a gang selling marijuana. Additionally, he had received a gunshot wound to the leg, which matched the descriptions John gave of the teenagers who killed Felipe Gonzalez. Based on this, Reggie was charged with murder, convicted, and imprisoned. While the lawyer delved into the case files, he found many things that would exonerate Reggie. Imagine that it took him 3 years to prove that Reggie had nothing to do with this crime, the crime for which he was imprisoned. The lawyer demonstrated with scientific evidence that Felipe Gonzalez, the victim who was murdered, was shot from a high position because the angle of the bullet entries in his body was as if they came from above. This meant that it was impossible for the shooter to have been at the same level as the street where he was shot. The shot came from one of the neighboring houses, from an upper floor, possibly from the window of the brothel manager John, who claimed to have seen the teenagers shooting at Felipe Gonzalez. This implies that perhaps John is the killer. Moreover, there were no fingerprints, DNA, or witnesses at the crime scene indicating that Reggie was the criminal. Even John, the brothel manager, later retracted his testimony and said he had told the police what they wanted to hear in exchange for allowing him to operate the brothel, which is illegal in the United States. But the most significant piece of evidence, and what the lawyer discovered, is that Reggie's leg wound, for which he was accused, was a gunshot wound but was an old injury. Reggie had been shot when he was 13 years old, 5 years before the crime he was accused of. It was clear that when the police saw this wound, they knew it was an old injury and that Reggie did not even limp. But it was evident that this police officer handling the case wanted to close it quickly. As we said, this was his first criminal case, so he wanted to record a victory as soon as possible. He saw that this poor Reggie was a gang member, so he simply accused him. Even though Reggie told them for a long time that he was innocent, he was eventually convicted. After Reggie was imprisoned, he spent a lot of time in the prison library consulting law books about false charges. Even during his time in prison, Reggie tried to stay away from violence and problems, but problems followed him. He was forced to defend himself and try to survive in an environment where he was accused of a crime he did not commit. Imagine that the lawyer had been working on this case for 3 years. During those years, Reggie was in solitary confinement after killing. Then the lawyer took the case to court again. Eventually, the judge ruled that Reggie was innocent of the first crime he was accused of. Regarding the murder of, the charges were reduced from first-degree murder to second-degree murder, and Reggie was sentenced to 10 years of solitary confinement in connection with the murder of Amra. This case took a long time, and when the sentence was issued, Reggie had already served 8 years in solitary confinement. Those 8 years counted toward the sentence, so he only had 2 years left to be released. After serving the last 2 years of his sentence, Reggie was finally released from prison in 2009 after spending 16 years incarcerated, 10 of them in solitary confinement. Although he went through tough times, he was happy with his freedom. After being released, Reggie entered into a long legal battle to regain his rights, and finally, in 2017, Los Angeles paid Reggie $5.2 million in compensation. Of course, this money would not compensate him for what he suffered while imprisoned, but it would at least allow him to live comfortably for the rest of his life from a financial standpoint. We hope you enjoyed this edition. If you liked the video, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to The Daily Astonishing.